And thank you to the Asia Society team for putting together this program. We all know by now how difficult it often is to put together such virtual programs, navigating multiple time zones, and all kinds of technical difficulties, as much as digital programs sound rather easy. I hope I'm audible before I begin the introduction to this panel. Kitki, quick word,
yes.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for attending. Just to give you a quick overview of how this panel is going to be laid out, and then we will proceed. I will be making a brief introduction. For any of you who want to look at the detailed bios of the speakers today, you can look up the website and the webpage of Asia Society's program, so you can find out more. So I will not be introducing them in more detail. After my 5-6 minute introduction, the panel is going to be primarily dialogic. It'll be a conversational format, so people will not be making presentations, but rather responding to some of the questions and provocations I will throw their way. Just to refer back to the Take South Asia issue that we at Ishara Art Foundation had the privilege of contributing to, of course, as a foundation that's only 5 years old and this year celebrated its 5th anniversary. We know we stand on the shoulders of giants, of people who have been contributing and working in the field for far longer, and it's really their generosity that has brought us at Ishara this far. As Ishara celebrated its 5th anniversary, we thought this would be a good occasion, not necessarily to just reflect on what the foundation's been doing, but also together with Take on Art magazine, think about what does South Asia mean and what does it connote today. And in fact, it was actually inspired by the questionnaire on the contemporary that Hal Foster had sent out to colleagues in Europe and North America in 2009, in which he was asking them to describe the state of the contemporary. Now, when I was with the Asia Art Archive in those years, the archive also brought out an expanded questionnaire on the contemporary, looking at different perspectives on the contemporary from other parts of the world, and specifically from Asia and Asian diaspora. This was really the inspiration for the Take issue, where we were fundamentally asking, what does South Asia signify today to different practitioners located in different parts of the world? As I mentioned in the introduction to the issue, it's only a magazine issue with all of its constraints, and by no means attempted to be representative of all of the voices. And I'm grateful that Asia Society and Take are organizing this panel that includes some of the voices that were not in the issue, and hopefully everyone gets a chance to maybe have more conversations around this. Some of the premise, rather, of that issue on South Asia was primarily to look at South Asia not so much as a self-evident geographic category, but rather as a historical category that has kept getting reevaluated, redefined over time. So South Asia has meant different things in different time periods and in different locations. More importantly, living here in the UAE, speaking for myself, you really palpably sense that South Asia, the definition changes on where it is invoked and in which historical moment. The way South Asia is defined, remembered, memorialized, nostalgicized in the UAE or in the Gulf would be different from how South Asia is defined, say, in New York, London, Sydney, anywhere else in the world, Berlin, South Africa. And at this very moment, the speakers we have on this panel themselves are dispersed in vastly different geographies. So certainly South Asia, and any discussion on South Asia, is not necessarily anchored in South Asia's geographic category, geographic location, as much as it is in its historical kind of moment. And we know quite well that the term South Asia has long served as an important geographic and geopolitical marker for, of course, civilizational narratives, but also modern narratives of the subcontinent. And its current definition, as we know, is largely inherited from the British Empire, which has had multiple reevaluations over the last century. In the post-colonial context, and since the Second World War, regional discourses have largely been based on affinities between nation states and realignments of empires. Consequently, there was the emergence of area studies in academia in the mid-20th century, the establishment of SAARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, in the mid-80s, and the framing of new markets in the neoliberal era, which also harped on South Asia. What becomes apparent in the short story is that, again, each invocation would bear differently on the regional contours that the term indexes, and therefore creates other and wider constellations beyond the geographic marker. In art history, South Asia has offered ways to critically examine discourses of nationalism, modernism, cosmopolitanism, and tradition. It has attended to the complex histories of partition, diaspora, migration, and transnational frameworks, which have often been missed out in national modern narratives. Yet the field of art is riddled with problematics of regional representation, as witnessed in the regional survey exhibition that have been happening since the turn of the century, along with the art market trends. We remember Okwi Onvizor's Century City, which was, instead of going through a national modern framework, that was looking at cities as important nodes to understand the 20th century, late 19th and 20th century. Furthermore, the regional frame of South Asia neglects a historical interconnectedness with adjacent regions like Southeast Asia and West Asia. So these are some of the points we wanted to keep in mind when setting off with this panel. And who I have with me today are panelists who I thought were a very interesting selection, because while they are representing Sri Lanka and Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh, we're also aware that some of them, in fact, have a position of difference, if not alterity, with the regions that they're representing here. So certainly none of the speakers are going to be national representatives speaking about South Asia. Some of the examples I just wanted to flag off when looking at existing initiatives that have looked at a wider discourse of internationalism. We all might want to remember the Asian Art Biennale in Bangladesh as one of the longest kind of ongoing biennales, with its first edition in 1981. Then there was the Triangle Arts Trust, which was established in 1982 by businessman Robert Loder and sculptor Anthony Caro. That kind of spawned from there on so many initiatives, artist-run initiatives as well, such as Khoj in 97, Tirtha in 2000, Vassal 2001, Britto 2002, Sutra also in 2002. We also know from the market side, Christie's and Sotheby's have been focusing on South Asia since the mid-1990s. So there have been all of these different nodes from where South Asia has been looked at, has had exchanges with. And I mentioned especially the Triangle Arts Network because that was really an important moment, at least in the recent past, where artists from across the subcontinent had exchange programs to interact with one another, as well as make art and present art together. Lastly, if I can just quickly flag the questions that were in the questionnaire in the Take on Art issue, because we're not going to be speaking of those questions necessarily today, but rather opening the discussion up further. So those questions were 4, actually, a very modest proposition. And those 4 questions were, number 1, what roles have art history, museums, and biennales played in complicating the understanding of South Asia? The second question was, how does art practice and curatorial practice locate itself in relation to South Asia? This is a question I was asking even the panelists in the preparatory chat we had the other day, that do they identify themselves as South Asian? And if so, what are the moments in which they have to invoke that? And when do they want to resist being invoked as South Asian? Question number 3, how does the discourse on South Asian art respond to the larger paradigm of the global South? And the last question in that questionnaire was, what are the limits of using South Asia as a trope to regard art, culture, and identity today? And what are the possibilities it opens? I'm aware, as I speak and moderate this panel, that there's suddenly a strong currency around South Asia all of a sudden. And that currency automatically seems to assume value, that if we're talking about South Asia, there's something self-evident about it. And maybe it's important to not regard it that way, that there's nothing self-evident about South Asia. It is a category, it is a term that needs a lot of critical reevaluation. As much as one may want to advocate for the shared histories of South Asia, across South Asian places and identities, we also know that in the face of right-wing nationalism, there's also a different kind of South Asia that is produced. Because if someone in one location is asked to leave because of their religious or linguistic identity, they're asked to go back to Pakistan or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka and not go back to, say, Saudi Arabia or Indonesia or someplace like that. So even xenophobia produces its own South Asia as much as liberal discourses produce South Asia. And I think that's something to keep in mind as to where we are today in this discourse. As much as it is being defined in one location, it is also defined very differently from another for very different ends. So on that note, I would like to welcome all of the panelists. It's a privilege and pleasure to be speaking to them today. They're all dear friends and practitioners who I admire greatly. I'm going to start actually with a question to each one at a time. And I'm going to start with Sanaathanan. Now, for those of you who have not had a chance to read the bio, I will only introduce him in one line to say that he's a contemporary artist. He is also an art historian. He is a lecturer, a senior lecturer in the University of Jaffna in Sri Lanka. And he was a senior of mine in university. So he has also been a friend and a mentor with whom I've had lots of conversations for at least a decade, if not more. Shana, I'm going to ask you first and foremost about your relationship with the term South Asia, and especially coming from a perspective where you have studied in India in your art history programs. You are currently teaching in Jaffna and in Colombo, both art history and art practice. And you have really been even developing your thesis around art history from the region. So how has this term had any influence in your thinking? I'll hand it over to you, Shana.
Thank you, Sabih. Thank you for the organizers for the opportunity. Yeah, so it's like I'll start with my a kind of a personal relationship with South Asia. So it's like when we were thinking about South Asia, actually India became a kind of a center figure in that, not because of its population and the land amount of landscape it's having. It's also sharing the boundaries with most of the other South Asian countries. So it's mainly South Asia means to me it's like India and others actually, and it's like a being in Sri Lanka and also this whole India-Pakistan partition and the whole discussion about the partition actually dominate the whole scene like positively and negatively in many cases, and also many of the curations and art projects and collaborations also decided according to that line. And if you see most of the foreign exhibitions, like the exhibition in the Europe or America and all these things, dominated by these two countries, not by the others actually. So in that case, there's an interesting piece interesting book written by Sujit Sivasundaram titled Island Debt, which actually talking about how Sri Lanka, the first partition happened in Sri Lanka in 19th century. In South Asia in 19th century, like in India, Sri Lanka is the Sri Lanka-India partition in which the Britishers actually, through different kinds of practices and discourses, divide the whole landscape. So like that, so it's like these boundaries also very important in understanding of this South Asia in different ways, because as a political entity, it's never existed as a kind of holistic landscape. So that's number one. So also, if you look at the art history, like early writings about South Asian art is like all titled as Indian art, and India is like an extension of Indian art as Sri Lanka or Burmese or something like that. but it's not a kind of South Asian art. So South Asian art never exists in the South Asia as a kind of category in art history. Actually came much, much later. And also in terms of practices, so in terms of courses, if you look at in many of the universities and all these things, we don't find anything like related to South Asia as such. It's it's like when I studied, there was no course about Pakistan or India in Pakistan or Bangladesh or Nepal in Indian syllabus. And similarly, in Sri Lanka, we don't have it. We have India because it's similarly because you share some of the histories with India, but other things are not relevant to you. So in a kind of a day-to-day basis, India may be relevant to me for many reasons, but other countries may be not relevant to me as a kind of a being in a kind of a South Asian kind of situation. So the other thing is like in terms of exhibitions and other kinds of things, if you look at, as you mentioned, this Tirtha or Khoj, this South Asian network is so important. At the same time, there are also biennales happening in most of the cities in South Asia. But if you look at these biennales, South Asia is not a content of these biennales actually. The content is some very international, and they wanted to appeal to the kind of a larger international community than South Asia. So for me, it's like in the recent examples are like, if you look at the recent exhibition, I think Iftikhar Dari curated a show on pop South Asia, which is actually very much, it's conceptualized South Asia through pop. Similarly, Riaz Kumu's work on young South Asia for Serendipity Festival art in Goa, it's also actually try to conceptualize young South Asia in a kind of a different way. So these are the kind of very interesting examples actually happening in South Asia. But apart from that, there's a kind of a question whether as a kind of a South Asia as a kind of a category in terms of visual culture or art history exists. So that I think with that I can end my this thing, and then if there are any questions, I can come back.
Thank you, Sanaathanan. Sanaathanan, if I can just probe you a little further about what do you teach, since you're looking at art history now. And we would have conversations around.
So it's like when we were teaching, it was like a kind of an Indian art history and Sri Lankan art history kind of situation. But I think after 2013 onwards, we included a course on art and nationalism in India and Pakistan. And later on, we developed recently that course into a kind of a larger course talking about art and nationalism in India, in South Asia, actually. And there's also a new course we introduced, concentrating on Park Strait as a kind of a point of exchange rather than a kind of a divider. Because we teach Sri Lankan art history differently, separately, and Indian art history separately. So rather than teaching it separately, we thought we can put this together and look at how these exchanges actually happening, artist migrations and all kinds of pilgrimages and other kinds of things, and situate art within that. So these are the kind of new initiative we made, and it's very challenging. So before us in 1970s, when the university was established, one of our senior historian actually introduced a South Asian Forum. And also there was a journal called South Asian Studies, actually. These are the kind of it's much before SARC and all kinds of initiatives, actually much before those kind of government initiatives. So actually he was thinking about this must be because of that's the time where all the nationalism is become a kind of a problem. One side you have a single Buddhist nationalism, and the other hand the Tamil nationalism is coming into the scene. So this may be a kind of his idea may be to just go beyond this kind of limits and think about a larger framework, and South Asia as a kind of a shared history, a shared culture, and you can't put these things, history or art history, into a kind of this regional or the political boundaries of it. So it must be. So these examples are like thinking about South Asia differently and conceptualizing it in a kind of a different way. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanaathanan. I'm going to move on to asking a question to Qudsia next. Qudsia, thank you for joining us. Qudsia, I want to ask you, actually, furthering some of the points that Sanaathanan has made, if you can tell us about the broader artistic milieu in Pakistan, particularly in terms of infrastructure and support systems for artists, curators, writers, such as universities, museums, festivals, artist-run spaces and galleries, and the role that Lahore Biennale plays in that ecosystem. I mentioned this specifically because we all know that the Biennale form has actually served many different purposes in different locations around the world. It sometimes fills all kinds of gaps. And it therefore cannot be generalized in any which way. I also want to add, before giving you the mic metaphorically, to say that actually the Pakistani passport, at least among all of us right now, happens to be the most difficult passport to move around the world with. If there's one passport that is very difficult to get entries, and especially visas, even tourist visas to many countries, it is Pakistani passport. Leave alone getting visas from India to Pakistan and vice versa, just Pakistanis traveling elsewhere. So you could really see that access to various geographies and access to various forms of international representation in events such as the Lahore Biennale comes with a lot of difficulty then. So if you could then tell us a little bit about the Lahore Biennale and the milieu in Pakistan from where you are situated.
Thank you, Sabih. And thank you for organizing this. Thank you, Asia Society India, and also Take on Art. Good point. So just to tell you, this morning I received an email from a bunch of people who would like to come to the biennial from Art Asia even. And the request that came to me in the email was, we need a letter, an NOC from your Interior Ministry, right? So if your Prime Minister President is on the top, the one next, the bureaucratic ladder finishes at the Interior Ministry. So that's what the level we have to go to get, visa security and other kinds of care, which we're happy to do. I'm planning to go there next week, and we hopefully will sort it out. Sometimes we are able to sort it out, sometimes not. But these are very serious concerns, and while we've been neighbors for forever, we were the same country for the longest time. It's just these inhibitions or hiccups that are placed in the way for creative minds. There was an exhibition conference not too long ago, a few years ago. I don't want to name it, but all of Pakistani speakers were not invited. So we're doing a major conference in India, and Pakistan's not included. So, I mean, these kind of things, we have to, cultural practitioners, art academics, these kind of things, we have to pay the price for it, but at the same time, just smile and move on, because that's the only other option that we have in front of these geographic kind of challenges. I think scholars like Salima Hashmi or Iftikhar Dadi and many others have actually spoken a lot about, survey kind of Pakistan art and movements and shifts. But I think maybe what we can talk more today is what the contemporary situation is like, what the contemporary, art practice is like, or things that move us. A lot of that has to, of who and where we are today goes to 9/11. Again, another one of those moments in history where everything fell apart for Pakistan, and the curiosity of what Pakistan is, where Pakistan is, came about, and the politics of it all came about, and the right wing started becoming stronger, and the geopolitics becoming stronger. But at the same time, the interest of Pakistan, what is this about? What is this nation about? Came about. I think that was a very problematic moment, a difficult, complex moment, but also a turning point for Pakistan, where we see a lot of inward looking, because a lot of people were then had to move by will or by other, deportation, other needs. They were moved back to Pakistan, like you said, go back to Pakistan. I think that was, in a way, a good awakening moment for a lot of people in Pakistan, where we start seeing, institutions like NCA and then further Indus Valley now expanding to, this interest in digital and other forms of arts also becoming prominent. So you see Beacon House University coming up. You see Institute of Art and Culture coming up, and these all other kind of interests in arts and culture because of one strand of events. But then you also see, Lahore Literary Festival coming up. All these movements and shifts started to happen because Lahore and Pakistan is a very resilient country, and despite all else, you see that there is this interest, this we have in many ways battled, dictatorships in 80s and, various martial laws and various kind of other things. So there is a inert resistance and resilience in the nature of the people. So we see, Karachi Literature Festival coming up. We see Karachi Biennale coming up. We see, Islamabad, Multan, all these places, they want to take a part in this movement. I think these kind of energies culminate into a very interesting melting pot kind of a situation where everybody wants to play a part and also understand and want to, look at the narrative, manage, take charge of our own narrative, So I think Lahore Biennale, I would like to say, is also an entity that was forged by a group of friends in response to the local conditions where, we saw, a great deal of discomfort that the city was going, for local, regional, political reasons. There were being bombs, civilians are getting affected, political, social situation is going, nowhere. And then, citizens had to respond, and, Lahore Biennale is also a response was created in response of that, to take ownership, to take, this space that was taken away from us and taken away very aggressively, to reclaim that. So the idea behind this was very simple: bring art in public spaces, something we knew what we could do, work with local realities, work with local knowledge, work with institutional knowledge. Because this was a new model, of course, there were all kinds of, issues and resistance in the government, but I'm not in a hurry. We're not in a hurry. We want to work with the pace that we can naturally achieve with the stakeholders that exist amongst us. And there are all kinds of social, political, all kinds of instabilities. A lot of people say that this is the toughest time Pakistan has ever seen, politically, socially, in other ways. There are a lot of wind against, creativity and otherwise. But it's something that we have taken on as a mission, one step at a time. We are working, but we see that we are not alone. The idea of the biennial was to create plurality, work with publics, and see how we can achieve a place we can just recognize each other. Our goals were very simple, very plurality was important. Getting, investigative learning, research-based approach was important, those kind of things. And these kind of things are easy to do for us because we're all part of the academic world. And we all sort of created this movement. But, we did the first biennial. It was just something that we all came together. The city got together. I think it went well. We were able to invite who helped us create a network. And I think that was the true turning point for LBF, where it was now not a wide range of, was able to create the network that it could work with, to create an environment that it could work with. So I think these were some of the important aspects that we have been exploring.
Thank you.
What?
Yes. Sorry? Did you?
Something else. What am I missing?
No, it's fine. It's a conversation. So, in fact, thank you for outlining in great depth some of the challenges that that the Lahore Biennale is really facing since its inception, in fact. And I think the last point that you mentioned is of particular importance in the kind of constellations geographically that the Lahore Biennale is kind of forming with the curators that you're inviting on board. Hoor for the second edition, John Tain for the new edition. So I'll come back to you and basically touching on some of these kinds of ways in which you're connecting geographies and how that kind of shapes the vision for a discourse on South Asia or Global South, so to speak. As with all biennales, we know that they're never supposed to be seen in isolation. They're supposed to be seen in a network of other biennales. One can say that the Sharjah Biennale, the Kochi Biennale, the Lahore Biennale, the Dakar Biennale, there's a range of Sao Paulo, there's a range of biennales in the Global South that I think play a very important part in shaping contemporary discourse around diversity and more complex histories of colonialism as well. On that note, I'm going to move to Sharareh. While Qudsia is the co-founder and executive director of the Lahore Biennale, Sharareh is an art educator, and she's the director of Srijnalaya, a Nepal-based art organization, and has been very closely connected to the Kathmandu Triennale program as well. So, Sharareh, I'm going to ask you the very same question about the broader artistic milieu in Nepal, especially the infrastructure and support systems for artists, curators, and writers, and the role that the foundation, including the Siddhartha Art Foundation, the Kathmandu Triennale, and the initiatives that you're involved with, what is the landscape that we're looking at, and what are the pressure points you're working with?
Sure. Hello to everybody. I don't know, can you hear me? Is everything okay? I feel like this online stuff is
all
good. Okay. No, I appreciate your question. I mean, I think it's, I think I wanted to kind of just to position myself a little bit in terms of the idea of art education and my interest in it. I've been involved in the art community for maybe a little over 15 years in lots of different capacities. And I think throughout, I've been interested in pedagogy. I've been interested in, what does all these different organizing, different kinds of ways that people gather, what do they do for us? For those of us who are involved, but also for those who come to the events and the different opportunities that people get as they're working and as we actually interestingly grow together, because it's kind of a small community, or it used to be even smaller. Now it's actually quite, it's slowly started to grow in many different branches, and it's kind of an exciting time. I guess it's always exciting, right? But it's exciting in that way that I feel like I'm at a point now where I can just do a lot of observing, witnessing, kind of listening, and maybe sit on the back burner a lot and just feel like I can learn a lot from other people. And we don't have to be the ones to jump in and try to do something, And so that's kind of the position that I'm sharing things from at the moment, and it's definitely my myopic view, obviously, right? But in terms of what you were asking about, what kind of support systems and the ways that people are working at the moment, it's interesting to me that I'll just work a little bit backwards. I mean, I think right now I feel the current way that the art community is working is what a really good friend of mine calls curiosities. I feel like there's this really fascinating way that people are kind of deciding to ground themselves. And I mean also people who are younger artists, people who are trying to think about what they want to make, and they're asking really amazing questions that instead of trying to look out, they're kind of looking in, and they're looking deeper. They're deciding to stand their ground. And in that process, they're asking really, really interesting questions that allow them to link themselves beyond Nepal, which, I really, it's kind of interesting to me that all the main speakers are non-Indians, and that you're asking Sabih as the person asking the question, because for me and for us, I feel in Nepal, it's kind of an assumption that we're always working within this realm of South Asia, because you're on the margins. And I feel like but whenever we talk about South Asia, Nepal gets positioned into the margin, right? And I feel like it's a double-edged sword for us, because it's on the one hand, it's this idea that, because we're on the margins, we get to just not have to deal with a lot. We kind of live in our own little bubble and do whatever we want in whatever way, and we take from things the way we want to take them. And then the other side is whenever we're looking for things like funding or like finding a way to kind of support the work that people are doing, because that requires resources, then we kind of have to quickly position ourselves as South Asia, right? Like, because otherwise we won't get access to any of that. And so it's this double-edged sword that you keep having to play. I mean, maybe many sides, many edges to the sword. And so, that's skirting around the question of challenges. But what I find most exciting is the vantage point that I find, because you're constantly playing with all these different, like, okay, how am I going to get to do what I want to do? But for me, I find it more interesting, this question of what is it that I want to do? The fact that a lot of the people now are exploring their curiosities, the kind of history of Nepal in the region for those of us who are living here now and have been in the art community. I think we've learned a lot about our art history, or about our history through art, in a way that maybe we were never taught in school, that we don't have access to, because there was a lot of limited, what kind of history is being taught is so limited. And so you have artists asking questions that are making them inquire about, who am I? And a lot of identity questions, right? Like, who am I, and why, what am I doing here, and all these kinds of things. And then you realize that the identities that people have in Nepal are so linked to the region. And then they start inquiring about their family histories, they start inquiring about the political histories in the region. And so through this process of inquiry and their curiosities, the fact that, they're presenting work and showing and exhibiting, in places like the Triennale, in places where, you have people who are not just, like, the audience doesn't become just Nepal. The audience is much more international in a platform like the Kathmandu Triennale. So the fact that they're sharing their curiosities as Nepali artists in a platform like that, whether that's as a curator, whether that's as an artist, and then have this audience that's much more international, and not just an audience, but they're inviting artists from the region and beyond, trying to look at this idea of finding affinities and alliances across the global South. And all that kind of a platform allows for that communication, and then you start realizing that, there's more connections and things like that. So for me, it's really fascinating that being on the margin of what is seen as South Asia allows for us to make these kinds of very, very fascinating connections through a platform like the Triennale as well, but through their own inquiry, not because anyone else is necessarily providing a platform to do those kinds of studies. And it's through the art, right? And I'm so babbling, I'm so sorry.
No, thank you. Actually, you raised a very important point, and especially this point around being on the margin, and therefore being a double-edged sword, of sometimes actually taking on board the South Asian narrative, especially increasingly now for funding reasons, but otherwise forming all kinds of other regional alliances. An example of that comes to mind immediately before I move to Tanzim, which is located in Cambodia with the Angkor Photo Fest. Now, we know that there's a strong photographic discourse as well as a lot of curated programs in Nepal around photography, with the Photo Kathmandu, with the Nepal Picture Library, and all of these initiatives, and so many photographers and artists going to Angkor for the workshops and pedagogic programs that also have a strong influx from Bangladesh and Myanmar. So you can see a whole different community forming around photography, where South Asia gets very closely connected to Thailand, Singapore, Myanmar, Cambodia, which doesn't necessarily seep into India all that much that directly. So as much as India might think it has a purview over everything, it actually doesn't, because there's a whole different discourse going on around image making, documentary photography, photography as an activist practice, all of which are closely connected. And there are practitioners from India, of course, that are also connected with the Angkor Photo Fest and the workshops there. But you can see that Nepal and Bangladesh have a very strong presence there. And on that note, I'm going to move on to Tanzim Wahab, who is a curator, researcher, and lecturer, and the festival director of Chobi Mela's International Festival of Photography in Dhaka, and has, just like everyone in this panel, had a strong investment in pedagogy as well. And so teaching, workshopping, all of these become very important. So Tanzim, on a similar note as the previous speakers, if I can ask you about not necessarily just the infrastructures and support systems in Bangladesh, but also how does South Asia figure into the conversations? If I might add, you're currently in Berlin, correct?
Yeah. Sure.
And I think there's a lot of, I guess, geopolitical tensions that you're experiencing living in Germany, even around the Biennale that was recently supposed to happen but called off, where you did not quite serve the role of a good South Asian curator, because one should have maybe positioned oneself differently there. But I won't ask you about that so much as to the relevance of South Asia in your conversations. I want to add just one more point that actually one of you among the speakers in the previous chat mentioned, that, sitting in Sri Lanka or sitting in Bangladesh, we're not sitting and thinking about South Asia that much. It's only when funding proposals and these things come up that actually we start thinking about South Asia. Otherwise, we're also looking at many other questions. So over to you, Tanzim, about how does South Asia appear in your thinking and practice?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Sabih, and my shout out to Asia Society India, Take on Art, and you. Well, I mean, you have already provoked me a bit with the question, but yeah, I mean, I will just quickly start with a disclaimer because I think my internet speed is not good today. I mean, it is regulated because there's this student protest going on outside. I'm mentioning this because we often talk about shared history when it's about South Asian solidarity, but this is also very disruptive histories. And in that sense, I'm totally kind of very distracted today. And yeah, just to let you know that I can be off or my words can break up. And I'm sorry for that, but I also start with a quick solidarity to the student for their quota reform demand and peaceful protest. Well, I mean, this is what we deal with all the time. So let's face the reality for talking about South Asia. But another disclaimer I can also give that I'm not an expert. I'm not coming from that art historical terrain to talk about, or defining or redefining South Asia. I'm a curator. Currently splitting my practice between Berlin and Dhaka. So that's also interesting direction, you can say, or crossing that can come up in the conversation. But I would like to really share some of the anecdotes by keeping the time in my mind, or thought bites, whatever you say. Me as a curator focus mainly on placemaking. It might be also place unmaking, but it talks a lot about infrastructure building. And for South Asia, that is a basic notion that we all have because we talk a little bit about bureaucracy in our own places. But this bureaucracy is also interestingly related to larger situation like censorship. And these are some of the recent realization I had, especially after this cancellation event, Sabi, you mentioned about of this German photo biennale, well, which got cancelled. We know about the cancel culture, but it's also cancel slash censorship slash pressure for stepping down. You can define or redefine it in many different ways. But that was a very interesting wake up call for me. And that gave me a good self reflection that, how in this very solid, genuine spirit of South Asian solidarity, sometimes maybe we all are also tokenized as South Asian. And this is actually a very important point for me to actually think and work on that. I mean, am I tokenized as a South Asian, or do I tokenize? Or is there a certain kind of horizontality or horizontal sensibility while we talk about South Asia? Because it's so easy for us to think about this kind of binary country to country equation, and there are 8 countries, but it doesn't always try to consider 1,500 districts, right? Or 50 million diaspora community who are also South Asians. And that complicates this notion of South Asia in a very different way. But well, I mean, that's why, in our prep meeting, I was actually raising this question, why it's always a conversation between Dhaka or Delhi or Dhaka or Colombo, but it could also be a conversation between Jaffna and Khagrachuri of Bangladesh, to talk about not only the shared history but shared struggle of current time. It could also be a conversation between Assam and Sylhet, but it's often between those canon big cities, and we are part of it. We carry the canon and the torch, and this is where we got cancelled. I really wanted to escape from this kind of binary of global South versus global North. I clearly realized that we are, with our infrastructure, it's kind of very top-down dependency, and the bureaucracy, if it comes from the top, then you can't help it, because you need a certain kind of infrastructural support, and the solidarity conversation often actually discusses the geopolitical struggle, but not much of your infrastructure. And this is how, this kind of top-notch crackdown sometimes doesn't help you to continue with what you do. So that's why once you talk about South to South, it's really important to redefine, for me personally, to see what South Asia we're talking about and what are we expecting from it. It's so easy to talk about multiplicity and the pluralistic society, but we haven't built the basic infrastructure. Sorry for this self-reflection, because while we got cancelled, for me, we were like 3 curators. Our curatorial team were not even fully paid. There were so many issues around our agreements, the legal issues. But I was just wondering, where can I actually find the judicial support? Although we have so many pockets of the communities and the networks, but me as a curator, I haven't also put much effort on this kind of bureaucratic support system, let's say, or to find a judicial way of looking into, is there any community who can guide me on that matter? But these are boring topics. But interestingly, these topics were not nourished, nurtured, cultivated much when we gathered together. And interestingly, I need to give a shout out to one forum or space or collective, Photo Kathmandu or Photo Circle, because they started as a small initiative, but they did amazing support, not only by writing a statement for us, but by being connected in that sort of situation. And that actually also showed me a way that, when we often talk about lots of institutionalizations around in these major cities, sometimes a smaller initiative in terms of scale has sorted out lots of different support systems that we might not know, but the crisis actually brings it up. We also had amazing support from one of our curatorial advisors. She's from India, Tanvi Mishra. But these are important things for us to bring out, that we need each other. Sorry, you gave me a cue?
Thank you, Tanzima. I don't mean to interrupt, but only add on further, because I'm glad you mentioned this. And this was one of the reasons why we've asked all the panelists questions around infrastructure and support systems, because one can see the closeness of intellectual solidarities with the hostility of bureaucratic and institutional kind of obstacles oftentimes. And I think that's really where a lot of the people of the younger generation are really struggling with, because whereas perhaps some of the former generation thinkers, intellectuals were very much part and parcel of larger policy-making machines. I think the managerialization and privatization of culture and museums and foundations and many of these things have also led to a kind of gap between places where infrastructural changes could be made or proposed, as opposed to them occupying a different silo. But one thing I wanted to ask in relation to these infrastructural questions is, you've mentioned, since you're in Berlin, of how much you're looking at pan-Caribbeanism being situated there, pan-Africanism, and this has made you start thinking about South Asianism as well. You also mentioned the other day about a space that is called the subcontinent and not the South Asian subcontinent, some kind of an art initiative. Could you tell us a little bit about what's going on in Berlin and what all you're thinking about this?
Sure. I mean, the Work for Sport initiative, it's also a cultural foundation, a private cultural foundation in Berlin, focusing on environmental justice. And I recently had a trip to Martinique as a part of Caribbean islands, but we also know about the colonized history of these islands. And I was really amazed seeing all these small groups of people, not only limiting the notion of the Creole society in the Caribbean, but trying to look into the larger solidarities across. These are like cross-continental solidarities, because coming from this African ancestral history, still the Martinican civil societies or the communities, and particularly artists, are actually thinking how it's also Pan-Africanism, which inspired Martinique to think about the future. You know, what could be an African future? Will it exclude Martinicans? Will it exclude the Caribbeans? And that sort of crossing for me was really interesting to see that, you know, I mean, it is much more complex from one geographical notion. Like when we talk about South Asia, of course, you know, we identify a location by calling it South. But there are multiplicity in its history and the baggages and the struggle, and how you can actually reconnect them together could be a very interesting conversations around it. And that's why, I'm in conversation with also this small group in Berlin who are representing diaspora communities, immigrants from South Asia, from all different kind of disciplines. And they have built a small space called Subcontinent. And some days ago, one of the topics they offered was the election situation between India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. It was a small room, but it was like filled with people, and the audience are mostly South Asian communities, but they were also part of the conversation, which clearly showed how much people need to share. And talked about the election situation of the subcontinent in a much more frank way, but it brought in questions in such an amazing, safe place that also brings up, you know, this whole notion of us limiting our access point. And I can give a small example to just conclude here. You also mentioned in the introduction, I'm part of Chobi Mela, this photo festival. But when Chobi Mela started, it was founded by Shahidul Alam, an artist, activist, and curator. And he was actually trying to see how not seeing Chobi Mela as a photo festival as only as an international platform, but can we have more like pan-continental spirit, at least to have this exercise of inviting people horizontally and not to overlook certain continent 20 years ago. And I think that sort of also thought process in his research helped the small curatorial team always to have a quick check on seeing that, you know, what continent is always missed out in the conversation. And he used to call it majority world. And many of us are also introduced to the term that, you know, where are the majority voices, and can there be a priority shift around it, is also a very interesting way to break out from the binary of global South and global North. So you see, many works are already done. We may need to resume some of the discourses around.
Thank you, Tanzim. Very provocative and lots to think about. I'm aware of the time, but I just want to add a small comment, and then we'll open it up to Q&A to the audience. I know I've only asked one question, but I think you've all been very generous in your responses and touched on many, many more points than just keeping it to one line of inquiry. And that comment is actually based on the conversation we had the other day, which is what would it mean to say decolonize South Asia? And to decolonize South Asia might mean to also decenter India out of South Asia, to provincialize India as opposed to keep India as the center of South Asia. And that's kind of what I'm hearing in everyone's responses, in that the centrality of the Indian subcontinent, the Indian ocean histories, and the India in all of this certainly keeps drawing a very long shadow onto the rest of the discourses somehow. And the others are often already drawing so many other kinds of relationships and connections, as we've seen from Sanaathanan's response to Qudsia and the curators coming from all these different places, and the impact of 9/11 on the history of recent Pakistan's politics and culture. Nepal and Bangladesh sharing so many connections, not to mention many other regions also being brought into the fold. And now, just hearing from Tanzim what is happening in Berlin with the subcontinent space. And here in the UAE, one is seeing all kinds of initiatives around South Asia for different reasons, of course. So on that note, I'm going to open it up. I do want to ask a one-line response from each of you before we move to the audience Q&A. Like it's like one of those, rapid fire rounds. I'll start with Shana and then move on to the others, just to keep sequence. Actually, I'll start with Tanzim, because Tanzim ended and he might have a fiery response already about really the limits of using South Asia as a trope with regard to your practice, and also the possibilities it opens. A very, very brief, literally like a one-line response. What are the possibilities and what are the limits South Asia as a term poses in your practice?
Yeah, the response will be personal, Sabih.
Yes, it is personal. Absolutely.
Okay, me coming from this kind of very hegemony of this ethno-nationalistic background of a Bengali of Bangladesh and ignoring the Adivasis and many different communities for years, I think this South Asianism helps us to understand the equity and intersectionality. A good reminder, especially now after October 7, and many of us can understand the risk of ethno-nationalism. So I think South Asia is going to be the right excuse to have the timely conversation around it. And the limitation is its strength too. So vis-a-vis, right? The strength is its own limitation too. So that's how I leave it.
Excellent. We're going backwards now. So Sharareh, would you like to respond to the same question?
Could you say it again? My brain is like in 10
No problem.
places. I'm so sorry.
The possibilities that South Asia opens in your practice and the limitations. If you want, we can come back to you.
No, got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I feel like there are so many affinities with Bangladesh, right? So I think it's in terms of the way, again, I'm going to repeat similar to a little bit of what I shared before.
The one-line response, huh?
One-line response. I mean,
yes.
There was this film called The Mouse That Roars by Peter Sellers that my father, I remember as a child, I watched it. And that's kind of the impression I've had about Nepal since I was a child. And I think that film kind of sums up a lot of our experience. So I'm kind of end with that.
Thank you, Sharareh. I must watch this movie. It's called what? The Mouse That Roars.
The Mouse That Roars.
Okay, thank you very much. Qudsia, to you, the opportunities it opens, the possibilities, and the limitations it poses to think about your practice in relation to South Asia. You are muted, Qudsia.
So the limitations are always obvious, always in front of us. Gap in institution, One second. So the limitations are always obvious. There are lots of gaps, right? And the investment in arts is very limited locally, and again, opportunities internationally. But I think the nice thing is we make our own opportunities, right? And the one thing that I've learned by working the last few years is that when you're at it, things start falling in place. For example, our investment in local knowledge, our commitment to local knowledge. And I think working with the grassroots, I think those kind of things are very crucial, very important to strengthen post, like how Tanzim said, post October 7th. I think there's a lot for us to think in terms of our institutional strength, regional strength. We will need to all come together with great force to actually build our own ground. So this is also another strength and perhaps a challenge which can be turned into strength. So I think yeah.
Thank you. Shana, the same question to you. What do you see as the possibilities and what do you see as the limitations of
South Asian identity as a kind of possibility in a way, like now we are facing a kind of a situation. It's like a nation state become a kind of a problem. Democracy become a problem because democracy is also dealing with number politics and things like that. And all religious fundamentalism is a kind of problem. So it's like when we draw this kind of lines, actually, when how kind of a situation we are in, that's a kind of a real situation. So I think to come out from this kind of a situation, South Asia may be an interesting thing to look at as a kind of a history as connected and shared cultures and things like that, because it's much relevant to us. Like you don't have a kind of a history without India or Pakistan in Sri Lanka. So, and also if you look at our own history writing, that's a kind of a problem we are facing with. So that's number one. And limitation, I think, like how to understand, how to make other regions relevant to us. That's the whole thing, this whole idea of South Asia. And we are actually, we are connected to certain parts of South Asia or certain parts of the history of the South Asia, and how the larger South Asia become connected to us and how to make that connected. So that's a kind of a bigger challenge to art and our other cultural activities.
Thank you, Shana.
Sabih, can I add a little bit? Just because I feel like
a one-line thing, because we have.
So the reason why I was saying Mao Set Roars, I realized I didn't explain it. Because I think that's dangerous, and I feel like the thing I would want to avoid in the context of thinking about South Asia as a country that has a history of thinking of itself as a Mao Set Roars is this constant needing to respond, or how when things are on a battlefield, you feel like you're on the defense. And that I think we need to completely avoid and really support people to engage in whatever they're interested in and wherever that takes them in relation to South Asia, not just thinking about this small bubble. And for me, that's really important. So that's why I was referring to it.
Thank you, Sharareh. And I just want to also mention that the term South Asia and the investment in the regional histories of South Asia is clearly being dealt with a lot outside of the subcontinent. You have the Museum of Modern Art coming out with primary documents, for instance, which are translating the history of art criticism and art writing across different languages to bring together in one compendium. And one can see sometimes that these initiatives have been quite obvious to so many thinkers within the subcontinent, having delved and tried to work on them for a long time, including Asia Art Archive, trying to map some of these histories together and conjoin some of the discourses. But we also know the difficulties. And again, some of these difficulties go back to the same bureaucratic as well as infrastructural obstacles that keep coming in the way. This panel is, I think, almost a testament to that. The fact that we're meeting online. Maybe if we could have met somewhere else, it might have been in some other country, except for one of the countries where we're referring to in South Asia. So we can see those limitations are still being imposed from state sites as well. I can see some comments and questions. For those who might want to add any further questions, you can put them in the Q&A box and I will be reading them out. Because we have limited time, and let me just quickly ask Ankita how much time we have for the Q&A so that I will then attend to some questions. Ankita, how much time
about
do we
15
have?
minutes.
15? Okay, so we can quickly try and race through some of them. I'll start actually by a comment from Tasneem Mehta, who's speaking as director of the Bhawdaji Art Museum, but also, I guess, in her own individual capacity. She says that I'm not sure the present regimes are receptive to the kind of infrastructural development for the arts that we all envision. So in fact, it is these similar disaggregated forums that might be more effective. That's a comment from Tasneem. I'll pick up 2 or 3 questions and I'll leave it to the speakers to respond to them, to whichever one you want to choose. I'll pick one, starting with an anonymous attendee asking, does India monopolize South Asia? Whoever wants to answer, I'll read out 2 more, and whoever wants to answer whichever one, please go ahead. I feel the connection, another anonymous attendee says that I feel that the connection is being forced between the different regions and its art practices. Could it not be a conducive space for art making to acknowledge relationships and institutions should exist, but do not and perhaps will not exist outside of the South Asian diasporic folks of some sort? So we might have to acknowledge that that spaces, disaggregated spaces outside may be, in fact, quite relevant. And I'll ask one more question, and then we'll take rounds of answers. Everyone has a choice to pick only one. So, or actually you can pick multiple, whichever ones you want to answer. A question from Chaitanya Sambrani, who's, I suppose, in Australia at the moment. Thank you for attending, Chaitanya. Chaitanya says, following on from Sabih's invitation to provincialize India, it may also be useful to remember and reiterate the hyper-reality of India as a category of the imagination historically. It seems to me that the project of provincializing India is a necessary condition for decolonizing South Asia. We recognize that India is an idea and that this has been a very persuasive idea for many centuries. Can any project aiming to provincialize and decolonize be effective without addressing hyper-realities that attend epistemological categories? That's a third question. So all of you, pick whichever 3 you'd like. They're also in the chat box. You can read them. Please try to answer briefly because we want to attend to more questions, and there are more coming in as we speak.
So I picked the infrastructure regime one, right?
Right.
The infrastructure
first and then Tanzim. Yes.
Right. So I think, again, we all are examples of very resilient nature. And then, we can't change our regimes. We can't change our government structures. In my part of the world, I work a lot with the government because I bring art into public spaces, right? So it's very important for me to have permission, for example, of these spaces, right? And then also doing what we want to do, but keeping the government at bay, right? I mean, these bureaucrats are there for like a few months to maximum a year, and they want to show the maximum work that they possibly can do. And they'll, their demands and their interests are very different. What we see, especially in South Asia, that I see these pockets of people who are doing some fantastic works like yourselves, and we create our own little universe from where we start, and we flourish, and then like-minded people keep coming and joining in it. So I think that this modus of operandi, I don't see that changing necessarily, but the good thing is that it feeds a lot of plurality, and it feeds a lot of research, a lot of in-depth research, a lot of research that is devoid of government control, devoid of other kinds of measures. And this is because people are investing their own time and interest. There is a certain level of authenticity and, publicness, or people actually making those initiatives in action, which is actually something very beautiful So we see a lot of that in Pakistan, from regional places like Lahoti Melo, where, people are actually working with the local stories and folk tales and craftsmen and those kind of things. Or in the city, we see a lot of people like Karachi cartography and those kind of things. And lots of other examples throughout South Asia as well. So I think there is something beautiful in this, that the people's initiative makes a certain, strength, that brings strength to it.
Thank you, Qudsia. Tanzim, you wanted to answer one of the questions?
Yes. Does India monopolize South Asia or not? Okay, let me make it very simple and quick. For representing South Asia, for representation, yes. And one doesn't need to think a lot to realize that. You can go to the very temporal linear art history and the representation of the rest of the places in South Asia, and you'll see, of course, history-wise, India is monopolizing the representation of South Asia. But in terms of the power dynamics or in terms of the monopoly itself, I think that's what I actually tried to say, that, we have now multifaceted, more cross-layered connections between some cities who are actually playing this role of the canon. So I will rather ask a question. Does Delhi, Dhaka, Mumbai monopolize the understanding of South Asia? But that complexity for me is really important to bring up. It's not the nation-to-nation same binary equation. It's something else. But we can also ask a basic question. If it monopolizes, what sort of negotiating ground we have? I mean, what does it represent to? And that also brings me this doubt about the tokenizing the rest of the places by these big cities.
I think this also, in a way, touches on Chaitanya's questions about the comment and question around the hyper-realities that come with this notion of India, this concept that is India. Does anyone want to answer any of the questions, Shana or Sharareh, any of the three questions I've asked so far? Otherwise, I'll move on to the next set.
Maybe you can move on to the next set.
Okay, we can even come back to some if something comes back. It's a question directly to Shana from an anonymous attendee asking, you mentioned that biennales in the region are not curated with South Asia in mind. It's more for Western audiences. Can you expand on that? Is that not changing?
Yeah, if you look at the number of artists and the locations in the South Asian biennales, then I think you can get the answer very easily. And also in some biennales, you have a good number of South Asian artists participating because for the other reasons, not as a kind of South Asia as an idea, but South Asia is much accessible in terms of funding, travel, and all these things. So that's what the South Asian artist preferences are happening within South Asia. So as you mentioned, this initiative by Museum of Modern Art in New York and the Asian Art Archive on primary document. So I'm part of the whole discussion. And the whole process, what we are actually learning is about your other and the other part of South Asia and whole art history of South Asia, the kind of discussions happening, how these things are interconnected. There are similarities and dissimilarities. And what is actually lacking in our exhibitions, in our education, in our publications, and all these things actually started coming into this thing. So it's become a kind of very big learning experience. My whole thing is, and biennales also play a kind of major role in terms of education, because also in a particular juncture of this history and all these a lack of facilities in terms of infrastructure and other kinds of things. So biennales also become a kind of a main point of learning. So in that case, what kind of learning actually the biennales made possible to us in terms of South Asia to cultivate a kind of idea of South Asia? That's a kind of a question. Yeah. So it's like how these South Asian biennales are different from the biennales happening in the other parts of the world.
Thank you, Shana. I'm going to ask another round of questions, starting actually with a comment from Sumitra Sundar, since Shana has just answered a question. Sumitra says, thank you for saying this, Shana. South Asia is rarely represented in the recurring exhibitions, and curatorial goals seem more shallow, for the lack of a better word. That was just a comment. There is a question from an anonymous attendee saying that since we're talking about the marginalization of identities, and shout out to Shana and Sharareh and the term South Asia, what do we think about the extension of South Asian identities into the internet space? Example, in the term Desi, which is increasingly used as a shorthand for South Asian. Does this further erase the nuances that artistic and cultural practices are trying to outline? That is one question. There's another question from Bushra Jamil, who asks, on an academic level, how come there's very less engagement between artists and designers? Do any of you think that's true, or do you dispute that? There is a question coming for Sharareh from an anonymous attendee. Would you like to touch upon the role of institutions in moving beyond Kathmandu to explore other practices and mediums? I'll ask these three now, and then we'll go on to another batch. And the next batch will be the final. I don't think I'll be able to ask all the questions. But so please keep your answers short, everyone.
Sure. So I'll address the question that was addressed to me, but also linking it maybe with a little bit of what some of the other questions are asking. But I mean, my interest in also this question is the worry that whenever you're thinking in opposition to something, like for example, I'm on this panel and then suddenly I'm speaking for Nepal as if, right? Which that's just crazy. But you know, there is this possibility that you flatten what's actually happening and the conversations that are actually happening, because there's so much more that's happening in what needs to happen or what's happening in Nepal. So, you know, when we're talking about South Asia, actually, the problem for Nepal is not just in opposition to South Asia, but it's the fact that, you know, in relation to the nature of the question itself, right? That it's also in relation to what Tanzim is saying, that a lot of what's happening in the art community seems to be happening in Kathmandu. And I do mean to say seems to be, because there's a particular definition of the arts that has grown as something within the region, and that limits what we are putting within this framework of what is the arts. So there's a lot of art happening in Nepal, you know, it's happening on an everyday basis. People are engaging in different forms for different reasons. There's a lot of expressive mediums. We are an extremely diverse community, which has been flattened within our own country, right? Because of our own political climate. So it's only now that you have particular educational institutions within even the art world that is allowing for these questions to expand the definition of art. So now we have art students and artists and people actually exploring different mediums. And there's so many more people, diverse people from different parts of the country that are actually involved in the arts community and redefining what we're actually creating. So in terms of, you know, the kinds of mediums that we would be referring to in Kathmandu, it's extremely limited. And it's because we get framed and we can kind of get away with talking about, like, I can just say that, oh, maybe because I was involved in the Triennale, I can get away with saying, hey, I was involved in the arts community, but I don't know, right? Because maybe I don't know enough. And I feel like I wish there were more resources and infrastructural support being given for people within Nepal to explore more within our own areas and then seeing where that takes us, right? So like what Tanzim was saying, you know, if you just explore a lot on the eastern side of Nepal, and if you even think about Maoism and the political climate that existed, you know, that's in relation to Maoism in Nepal, it's related to the Naxalite movement. So it's extremely linked with the Bengal side of things, right? And moving into that region, we're extremely connected with the rest of the region. You just have to ask and think about these things. There were a lot of, you know, posters and ways that people were communicating in relation to, you know, expressing, trying to talk about communism and Maoism through different mediums that were going across the region, across borders. You know, so if we just have more infrastructural support to have those kinds of questions, then we would really open up ideas about medium. We would really think about, well, these definitions of art and design, even the question about artists and designers, there's a whole long history of artists and designers working together and having to work together for a long period of time within whatever we're calling as like modern history, right? So, I mean, for me, I wish there was more happening in relation to supporting people to go deeper in asking these questions and, breaking down these ideas of India, there's so many interesting ways that we're connected to India, and the way that India has played a very fascinating role in the region. So if we just let down some of our, defensive kind of, and just spread a little bit of the love, like spread the resources so that more of this work could happen, even in a place like Nepal, you'd find very fascinating inquiries across, right? So I don't know if I actually answered the question, but there's my.
Thank you, Sharareh. Does anyone want to take any of the other two questions that I picked up? Qudsia, very quickly, please.
I want to actually take up another question, the question about biennials and South Asia. I mean, also because it just connects very deeply. As I mentioned that, the coming, shared histories, heritage, vernacular culture, all of these places are this is very important to us. But the coming biennial is on ecologies and climate and sustainable futures. The one thing that we come across this whole time, I mean, I'm going to take Sharareh actually her conversation forward, is, one that we want to bring identity and, separate ourselves from one another to define identity. But when you go deeper into the research, deeper into the investigations, you realize how connected you are, how incredibly important it is for all of us to actually act as a unit in some capacity. So, for example, like since 2018, we've been working on climate in various capacities, and we're planting various indigenous trees and, looking at ecologies and those kind of things. And the one thing that we come up with, battle with all the time is that the geography of this area is such that there's an indentation in the geography. So when the cold air comes, the smog is trapped. And no matter how much we say, you crop burning or I'm crop burning, we all need to actually act as a unit. What Bangladesh did with, calling the rivers as living entities, I think it's really important. It influenced us all, right? And that decision kind of like making everybody think. So I think it's one of those things that we have to look into very deeply. The foundation has been working with the South Asian community and the artists. The first biennial, we had like 32% of the artists were South Asian. And the second edition, 25% of the artists were scholars included were South Asian, just because it is a conversation we must continue having. And the deeper we go into research, the deeper we try and understand who we are, the deeper we understand how connected we all are.
Thank you, Qudsia. And on that note, I'm sorry I won't be able to take everyone's questions. It's been a very, very engaging forum today. I'm glad you brought up the question of climate change, Qudsia, and climate crises, because at least over the past few years, we've been seeing so many all around the world, and a different kind of contour of the region gets drawn because of this. In fact, as it so happens, one of the largest populations of climate refugees, in fact, around the world, come from Bangladesh, among other countries like Vietnam and these delta regions and coastal regions. And Amitav Ghosh has written about this. Ashish Nandi many years ago talked about the hubris of people who think that they have the power to draw a line. And you can see on the continent of Africa how many straight lines there are on a topography that is so undulated. And I think that is the fundamental question right now of how rigid are these lines that divide compared to the fluidity of cyclones as well as shared resources, both disasters as much as solidarity. Sorry, Qudsia, you wanted to say something?
All are fairy tales, all are folklores, all are, talks about nature in a certain way, the coexistence, the human lives, It just talks about balance, especially for the South Asian countries, the way that we've been brought up to live, the Sufi culture, the Buddhist culture, all those various ways of living and practice. We just need to reconnect with our own shared knowledge. And I think the answers are all there.
And maybe invent new ones so that we also don't get trapped in traditions that also come with their own baggage of symmetries.
I was just talking about the knowledge.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you, everyone. This was extraordinary to be together and speak about some of this in a very short duration of time. There could easily be a few other panels like this, especially hearing from artists and what they, Shana is an artist here, so I don't want to exclude him from this. But there's so many young artists who are attending this panel, and I think the perspectives they would bring would be very different. The older generation artists would bring a different perspective. And you can see the question of infrastructure again looming large there as to which nationalities are getting privileged in residencies, in grants, and fellowships, which kind of students and universities are getting certain kinds of circulation. And all of those are certainly influencing the contours of this region that we define as South Asia. In the midst of a lot of rhetoric around the largest economies, the growing economies, the most promising countries in terms of financial gains and all of these things. So it's certainly a very polarized and volatile kind of a climate to be discussing this in, but the stakes are high. And so I'm very privileged to be speaking to people who are making real contributions and thinking about this, in teaching and discussing these in all of their context. Thank you, everyone, once again. Thank you, everyone who's attending. Thank you to Asia Society, but also to Take On Art Magazine for co-organizing this panel. I'm sure with many of you, we'll continue to be in touch. Thank you again, everyone, and take care.